The horn started tuning 40 minutes before the halcyon wing broke atmosphere, and Petra Lund felt every practiced note of them in her back teeth. She had Oni up on her hip in the robing room off the nesting spire's east gallery, wrestling the child's left arm through a ceremonial sleeve of stiff amber brocade that had clearly been designed by someone who had never once tried to dress a 22-month-old who did not want to be dressed. Oni arched and squawked and tried to fling herself backward off Petra's arm entirely, and Petra caught her the way she always caught her, one palm flat and warm against the small of the child's back, absorbing the lunge instead of fighting it. "I know," Petra said, in the low, even register she used for everything from thunderstorms to skinned knees. "I know it's itchy, one more arm." "No sleeve," Oni informed her, with the flat certainty of a toddler laying down policy. "Sleeve," Petra said back, just as flatly, and got the arm through on the second try, mostly because Oni got distracted by the sound of the horn swelling again outside, 3 floors down and a world away in the plaza where half of Cindergate had turned out under a sky gone the color of hammered brass, with the halcyon wing's re-entry burn. Down in that plaza, on a platform built to hold the Ember Throne's whole household, plus the Regency Council, plus enough cameras to broadcast the moment across every relay in the Corail Dominion, Warden Reveth Iskar was already standing in his second-best formal plumage, watching the same sky Petra could see through the gallery's tall windows, and doing the math on what this homecoming was actually going to cost him if it went the way the sovereign clearly wanted it to go. It was not going to go that way. Not because Reveth Iskar wished it ill, whatever else could be said of him, and a great deal could, he did not wish the Ember Throne's own heir ill, not even a little, but because Reveth Iskar had read the same nursery logs Petra had been filing twice a week for 19 months, and he understood, in the dry administrative part of his mind that never fully switched off, exactly what those logs implied about what a Corail infant's small nervous system had learned to do with the sound of massed war horns and amber light, and a crowd roaring in one voice. He did not say any of that to the chief herald standing beside him, adjusting the ceremonial glass that would catch and relay the sovereign's first steps down the flagship's ramp to every household screen on viral. He simply watched the sky and waited, the way he had waited through 6 years of Regency work to see whether the Dominion's oldest laws would ever actually matter to the people they governed, or whether they would keep being decoration, the way decoration always won when it stood next to a mother's face on the day she came home from war. None of that stillness had existed yet 12 hours earlier, in the deep quiet hours before dawn, when Petra had given up on sleep entirely, and gone looking for someone else who might still be awake in a palace that never fully slept the night before a sovereign's homecoming. She found Ray Holt exactly where she expected to, in the small archive room off the Crown Nursery's east wing, surrounded by 20 years of bond nurse case files stacked in towers that would have made any Corail administrator wince, working through a cup of something that had gone cold an hour ago. Ray had run the bond nurse program since 3 years before Petra was even old enough to apply to it, one of the original Relief Corps volunteers who had stayed on viral after the first wave of post-war contact work ended, because she had found, in her own words, that she was better at this than at anything waiting for her back on Earth. "You should be asleep," Ray said, without looking up from the file in front of her. "So should you. I'm old. I don't need it the way you do." Ray finally looked up, taking in Petra's face with the particular unhurried assessment of someone who had trained a dozen bond nurses before her and watched most of them break in one of 2 specific places. "Tomorrow's going to be hard." "I know. I don't think you do, actually. I don't think anyone fully knows what tomorrow's going to be until they're standing in it." Ray closed the file, folded her hands, and studied Petra with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite warning either. "You've done everything right for 19 months. Whatever happens on that plaza tomorrow isn't going to be about anything you did wrong." Then why does it feel like it already is? Ray was quiet a moment. Because you love her, she said simply. And loving a child you were only ever supposed to be borrowing was always going to come with a bill attached eventually. I told you that on your first day. I don't think either of us believed it would come due quite this publicly. Petra sat down across from her, on a low stool that had seen better decades, and found herself saying the things she hadn't said out loud to anyone in 19 months, not even to herself in the honest privacy of her own head. I keep thinking about Halden's rest. Ray didn't ask her to explain. She had read the file, of course. Every bond nurse's intake record included a full accounting of the childhood history that had led them to the program. But she waited anyway, because some things needed to be said again in a person's own voice before they finished meaning anything. I was 7, Petra said. The border raids that hit my colony weren't even part of this war, a much smaller, older fight, nothing anyone off-world ever heard about. It took the power grid down for 11 days. It took my parents on the third one. There was a relief worker, I don't even remember her name anymore, which is its own kind of terrible, who found me in a supply shelter with my grandmother's blanket and nothing else, and she didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful available. She just sat with me, matched her breathing to mine until mine slowed down to match hers instead. Did that every night for 11 days until the convoys got through. Petra looked down at her own hands. I don't remember her face. I remember exactly how her hand felt on my back. 4 counts over and over. I didn't know until I was 19, reading the program's founding research, that what she'd been doing had a name and a whole clinical literature behind it. I just knew it was the only thing that made the shelter feel survivable. And you decided you wanted to be that for someone else. I didn't think as far ahead as what it would cost me to actually be good at it. Ray reached across the table and closed one weathered hand over Petra's, briefly, the way she rarely did with any nurse she ran, because she believed, as a matter of professional discipline, in not modeling too much attachment for people who needed to learn to hold their own steadiness. She made an exception, this once, for the morning that was coming. Whatever happens on that plaza, she said, you already gave that girl 11 days' worth of somebody's hand on her back, multiplied by 600 nights. Nobody can take that back out of her, whatever the council decides about the rest of it. Now go try to sleep. You've got about 3 hours before this palace stops pretending it's still nighttime. Petra did not sleep in the end, but she sat with that conversation instead of her own fear for the remaining hours before dawn, and it was steadier company than fear had ever been. Aboard the Halcyon wing, in the observation blister above the launch bay, Sovereign Thessaly Marn stood with both hands pressed flat against the cold viewport glass, and watched Cindergate's spires rise up out of the haze to meet her, and felt something in her chest that 20 months of the Longdark Reach's worst nights had never quite managed to produce. She was afraid. She had not been afraid at Amaranth Reach, when the Syndral counterfleet had come out of the debris belt in numbers her own tacticians hadn't modeled, and she'd had to commit the reserve wing 40 minutes ahead of doctrine or lose the whole flank. She had not been afraid 3 months before that, standing over Commodore Ashravel's cooling body on the Halcyon wing's own bridge, giving the order to press the advance instead of falling back to bury the dead properly, because the dead did not care, and the living still needed the system taken before winter closed the approach lanes. She had done 20 months of things that should have frightened her and hadn't, because fear was a resource, like fuel or ammunition, and she had learned early in her reign to spend it only where it bought her something. This bought her nothing. This was simply the plain fact of her daughter, 22 months old, whom she had held exactly 11 times in the child's whole life, 6 of those times in the first 6 weeks before the reach began, and she did not know, she genuinely, physically did not know, the way she knew every other fact that mattered to her command, whether Ondine Marn would recognize her mother's face at all. 5 minutes to ramp, Sovereign, said her aide. a steady older Corail named Vesk who had served 3 sovereigns and buried 2 of them, and had learned somewhere in that service not to comment on the particular stillness that came over a monarch's plumage in the last minutes before a homecoming. "Thank you, Vesk," Thessaly said, and made herself turn from the window, and did not let her feathers show him one single thing more than that. Down in the robing room, Petra finished the second sleeve, set Oni on her feet on the gallery's cool stone floor, and crouched to look her properly in the face, the way she'd learned to do every single time something big was coming, because Oni took the world in through faces first and through words a distant second. "Your mother's coming home today," Petra said. "You remember I told you that." Oni's crest down, the soft juvenile feathering along her scalp that hadn't yet come in with the color shift markers of an adult Corail's mood plumage, twitched once, uncertain. "Mama," she said, testing the word the way she tested most words now, turning it over like a stone to see what was underneath. "That's right. Mama's ship is landing right now. We're going to go down and see her." Petra kept her voice even, kept her hands loose and unhurried on Oni's small shoulders, and did not let herself think about the fact that she had spent every single ember drill of the last 20 months teaching this child that horns and amber light and a roaring crowd meant one specific thing, and that thing was not Mama. She had known this morning would come. She had known it for 19 months, ever since the Regency office had first placed her in this nursery with a 2-month-old infant and a folder of protocols, and a war that showed no sign of ending on any schedule anyone could plan around. She had told herself, across all those months, that when the day finally came, Oni's own instincts would simply know the difference, that some deep animal part of a child would recognize her own mother's scent and shape the instant that mother knelt down and opened her arms, and all of Petra's drilling would simply fall away, unnecessary, the way a scaffold falls away once the building underneath it can stand on its own. She did not fully believe that anymore. She had not fully believed it for about 6 months, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be, in the small private hours when nobody else needed her steadiness. But she had also learned, in 22 months of doing this work, that there was no version of today that improved by her standing in this robing room being afraid of it out loud. So she smoothed the last wrinkle out of Oni's absurd little ceremonial collar, picked her up, settled her on her hip exactly the way she always did, and carried her down toward the plaza to meet a mother the child had almost no memory of at all. The horns were in full voice by the time they reached the platform's edge, 40 instruments in the old war signal register that the High Roost had used, unbroken, for 6 centuries, to announce every sovereign's return from every campaign, a register built, deliberately, to be heard over a battlefield, which meant it was built to be loud and low, and to carry through crowd noise the way almost nothing else could. Oni's small body went rigid in Petra's arms the instant the first full chord landed. Petra felt it happen, felt the sudden hard stillness run down through Oni's shoulders and spine, the particular stillness that in 19 months of ember drills had always, without one single exception, come 30 seconds before the child either shrieked or shut down entirely, and did the only thing 19 months of practice had ever taught her to do about it, which was press her palm flat against Oni's back in the 4-count rhythm they both knew without either of them ever having to think about it. Low and slow, the rhythm of a lullaby that had no more words left in it, only the shape a grandmother's hand had once pressed into a much smaller Petra Lund's back on a much worse night than this one. It was not enough. Petra had known, some cold, clear part of her had known before they ever left the robing room, that it would not be enough, because the 4-count worked in a dim, quiet room with the blinds down and nobody watching, and it had never once been tested against 40 war horns and 11,000 voices in an open plaza under a sky still smeared orange with a warship's re-entry burn. The ramp came down. The chief herald's voice rolled out over the relay, announcing the sovereign's return in the old formal cadence, and Thessaly Marn came down the ramp in her command plumage with the dust of the Reach still ground into the creases of her boots, and every camera on Viral caught the exact moment her eyes found her daughter across 60 meters of plaza, and her whole face broke open with something so raw and unguarded that Reveth Iskar, watching from the platform, felt his own breath catch despite every careful thing he had planned to feel about this morning. She crossed the plaza fast, faster than protocol called for, faster than any sovereign in the recorded history of the Ember Throne had ever crossed a homecoming plaza, and went down on both knees in front of Petra and opened her arms, and said her daughter's name in a voice that cracked clean through 20 months of command discipline. Ondine. And Ondine Marn, not yet 2 years old, heir to the Ember Throne of the Corail Dominion, looked at the war-marked stranger kneeling in front of her with arms outstretched, and a face full of horns and amber light and roaring noise stitched into every part of her, and did the only thing 19 months of careful, loving, necessary training had ever taught her small body to do when that exact combination of signals arrived all at once. She screamed, twisted her whole body away from her own mother's open arms, and buried her face hard into Petra Lund's shoulder, fists knotting into the fabric of Petra's collar with a grip that would leave small bruised half-moons on Petra's collarbone for 3 days afterward, and would not let go. The plaza did not go silent. 11,000 people do not go silent, not really, not all at once. There was a low, confused murmur instead, a texture of sound shifting underneath the horns, which someone in the relay booth had the presence of mind to fade out 4 seconds too late, so that 4 full seconds of that murmur, and the sight of a war-worn sovereign kneeling with her arms still open and empty in front of 11,000 witnesses, went out live across every screen on Viral before anyone thought to cut the feed. Thessaly Marn stayed exactly where she was, on both knees, arms still half raised, for one long unbearable second more than dignity required, watching her daughter's face pressed into a stranger's shoulder, a young human woman she had met exactly twice, both times through a security debrief before the Reach began, whose name she had to reach for a full half-second before it surfaced. And then, because 20 years of rule had taught her one thing above all others, which was that a sovereign's body kept moving even when the rest of her had gone somewhere very far away, she lowered her arms and stood, and turned that broken open face back into the composed one the cameras had been trained on her whole life, and said, in a voice only Vesk and the herald standing close enough to hear it, "Get the relay cut, now." It went out anyway. 4 seconds of it, replayed within the hour on every private channel and unlicensed relay from Cindergate to the border stations, and by the time Thessaly Marn made it back inside the High Roost's walls, the whole Dominion had already seen the moment its sovereign came home from 20 months of war to watch her own daughter reach for a human instead of her. Petra saw none of the broadcast in that first hour. She was too busy carrying a still-shaking Oni back up through the gallery, murmuring the 4 count against her ear, feeling sick in a way that had nothing to do with the horns and everything to do with the look that had crossed the sovereign's face in the half-second before she'd covered it. Not anger, which Petra could have understood, could almost have wanted, because anger would have been simple. It had been something much worse than anger. It had been the particular, silent devastation of a woman realizing, in front of 11,000 witnesses, that she had spent 20 months fighting a war to come home to a child who did not know her. By the time Oni's breathing settled and her small fists finally loosened from Petra's collar, Warden Reveth Iskar was already 3 sentences into drafting the emergency motion that would, within 11 days, put both the sovereign's fitness and Petra Lund's entire future in front of the full Regency Council. Reveth Iskar did not draft the motion out of malice. He wanted that understood later by anyone who cared to look closely enough at his record to see it, though almost nobody would in the weeks that followed, because a scandal this raw did not leave much room in anyone's attention for nuance. He drafted it because he had spent 6 years as warden of the Regency Council reading, Reports the Crown Nursery's own physicians had filed twice a year since the human bond nurse program began. Reports that used careful clinical language to describe something Reveth Iskar's grandmother's generation would have called, without any hesitation at all, a child raised by the wrong hands. And because the nesting writ, that old half-forgotten statute buried 3 centuries deep in the Dominion's founding law, existed for exactly one purpose: to let the council step in and correct a royal household's caregiving arrangement whenever the reigning sovereign was, in the writ's own dry phrase, operationally compromised by the burdens of command. 20 months at the front, ending in a public collapse of the most basic bond a mother could be expected to hold, was about as operationally compromised as the writ had ever been asked to address. Reveth Iskar believed, with the particular calm certainty of a man who had never once in his career been wrong in a way that mattered to his own conscience, that he was simply doing his constitutional duty. He also understood, in the same clear-eyed way, that a sovereign whose fitness the whole Dominion had just watched fail on live relay was a sovereign whose Regency Council suddenly had a great deal more leverage than it had held in 20 years. And Reveth Iskar had not spent 6 years quietly cataloging every place the Ember Throne's authority overreached the old constitutional bargains without knowing exactly what to do with leverage when it finally arrived. He filed the motion the following morning. By the time Thessaly Marn read it alone, in the small private study off her own chambers, still wearing the same command plumage she'd worn off the ramp, because she had not yet found a version of herself steady enough to change out of it. The motion had already gone out to every seated member of the council, with a formal request for an emergency fitness review hearing inside of 2 weeks, and a companion recommendation, filed under Reveth Iskar's own name, that the Crown Nursery's human bond nurse be relieved of her post effective immediately, pending review, in the interest of restoring proper lineage bonding to the heir's earliest and most formative years. Thessaly read that sentence 4 times before she made herself stop reading and go find her daughter. She found Petra instead first, in the nursery's small side room, kneeling on the floor beside a low table where Oni was working with fierce 2-year-old concentration on stacking 4 wooden blocks that kept tipping before the 5th would sit. Petra did not stand when the sovereign entered. She had learned, in 19 months, that standing fast and formal in front of Oni, when something changed in the room's energy, only taught the child to be afraid of changes in energy. And she had decided a long time ago that, whatever the cost to her own standing with the crown, she was not going to spend that particular currency. "Sovereign," Petra said instead quietly from the floor, and Oni looked up at the sound of the word, saw the woman standing in the doorway and went very still again. Not the raw scream-and-flee stillness of the plaza, but a smaller, warier version of it, watching. Thessaly stayed in the doorway. She did not try to cross the room. She had learned that much, at least, in the single worst day of her reign. "I read Warden Iskar's filing," she said. "I heard," Petra said. "The kitchen staff had it before I did, but I heard." "I have not signed anything." Thessaly's voice was very careful, very level, the same voice Petra imagined she'd use to order fleets into contested space. "I want you to understand that before anyone else tells you otherwise. I have not signed anything, and I do not intend to." Petra looked up at her properly then. This woman she had met twice before a war and once, catastrophically, in front of 11,000 people, and saw something underneath the careful command voice that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not the smug satisfaction of a mother reasserting her claim, but something closer to a woman standing at the edge of a hole she couldn't see the bottom of, trying very hard not to let the vertigo show. "Sovereign," Petra said, "can I say something that might not be my place to say? You watched my daughter's whole life happen while I was 3 systems away burying my own officers," Thessaly said. "I think you have earned considerably more than that." Petra chose her words the way she chose everything with Oni in the room, slow and steady, no sharp edges. What happened on the plaza wasn't about you failing at anything. It was about horns and crowd noise and amber light. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. We run drills in this nursery. We've run them since before you left, actually. They were already directorate-recommended protocol by the time I got here. And the drill signal for an incoming strike alert is horns, dimmed to amber emergency lighting, and a crowd of staff moving fast through the halls. Your homecoming procession hit every single marker in that drill by pure historical accident, because the horns and the ceremonial colors are 6 centuries old and nobody who built them was thinking about what a scared toddler's nervous system does with loud brass instruments and orange light. It wasn't you. It was the sound. Thessaly was quiet for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that Petra couldn't quite read, not relief, not yet, but the first crack of something that might become relief later, once it had time to sit. "You're telling me," Thessaly said slowly, "that my own daughter's body mistook her mother's homecoming for an attack." "I'm telling you her body did exactly what I trained it to do to survive an attack," Petra said. "Which is not the same thing as saying she doesn't know you. It's saying the drill worked. I just never," her voice caught, for the first time, on something she had clearly not let herself say out loud before this moment. "I never once thought through what it would mean if the drill worked on the day you actually came home." Neither of them said anything else for a while. Oni, apparently satisfied that neither of the 2 large watchful adults in her room was currently a threat, went back to her blocks, got all 5 to balance for a full 3 seconds before they toppled, and shrieked with genuine 2-year-old delight at her own accomplishment. And both women, despite everything sitting unresolved and enormous between them, found themselves smiling at the same small, ridiculous triumph at almost exactly the same moment. "I am not going to let the council take you out of this nursery," Thessaly said finally, when the smile had faded and the harder conversation had reasserted itself. "Whatever Reveth Iskar thinks he's protecting, he is not protecting my daughter." "You are." "With respect, Sovereign," Petra said, "I don't think that's actually a fight you can win by simply refusing to sign a piece of paper." She was right, though neither of them yet understood how right, or how much worse the next 11 days were going to make the answer. The first real test of that promise came 4 nights later, before either of them had said one word yet about drills or 4 counts, when Thessaly decided, without consulting Petra at all, that she was going to put her daughter to bed herself. It was not an unreasonable decision. It was, if anything, the most natural decision in the world for a mother 20 months returned from war, and Thessaly told herself that firmly, standing in the nursery doorway at the ordinary evening hour, watching Petra gather up the bath things and the evening story cards with the easy, unthinking competence of 600 repetitions, and telling her, with as much command certainty as she could put into a sentence about a bedtime routine, that she would take it from here tonight. Petra hesitated. Thessaly saw her hesitate, saw the half-second calculation cross her face. The same calculation Petra ran a dozen times a day about when to speak up and when a mother's own instinct deserved room to try, and then watched her set the story cards down, say something quiet and encouraging to Oni, and leave the room, because Thessaly was the sovereign and Oni was her daughter, and there was, in the end, no version of Petra's employment that included overriding that. It went wrong slowly, the way these things did. Thessaly got the bath right. Oni had always liked baths. That much needed no special protocol, and got most of the way through the bedtime story before the summer storm that had been building over Cindergate all evening finally broke, throwing a hard flicker of actinic white light across the nursery windows, followed a half-second later by a low grinding roll of thunder that the old high roost's ancient stone conducted straight down into the room's very walls. It was not amber light, it was not horns. Thessaly told herself that, in the first frozen second after Oni went rigid in her arms, that whatever was about to happen was some other thing entirely. And she was nearly right, except that the thunder's low grinding roll sat in almost exactly the same register as the ember drill alarm's opening chord, close enough that a nervous system trained by 19 months of war to treat that specific frequency as danger did not pause to check the fine print before it responded. Oni began to scream, the same raw, full-throated scream from the plaza, and thrashed against her mother's arms with a strength that startled Thessaly more than she wanted to admit. And Thessaly did the only thing 20 years of command instinct offered her in that moment, which was to hold tighter and speak louder. The voice of a woman used to being obeyed the instant she raised it. And it made everything worse, because a raised voice was one more input a frightened child's body had learned. Across a war-torn palace's worth of real emergencies, to read as confirmation that something was badly wrong. By the time Petra heard the screaming through 2 closed doors and came running without waiting to be called, Thessaly was sitting on the nursery floor with her daughter shrieking and rigid in her lap, her own hands shaking with something that had nothing to do with any battle she had ever fought, tears standing in her eyes that she made no attempt at all to hide, because there was no version of dignity left to protect in that room. "I don't know what I did," Thessaly said, when Petra crouched down beside them. "I don't understand what I did wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," Petra said, already moving, already matching her palm to the 4 count against Oni's back with the ease of 600 knights, feeling the child's screaming begin, almost immediately, to fray at its edges into something that could eventually become crying instead. The thunder hit the same register as the drill alarm. That's a coincidence of physics, not a verdict on you. It felt like a verdict. It's not one. Petra kept her voice low, kept the rhythm steady, and did not stop even to look at Thessaly directly because Oni still needed the whole of her attention. You held her. You didn't leave. You sat on this floor instead of calling a guard to come manage it for you. That's not nothing sovereign. Most people in your position would have handed her straight to staff the second it went wrong. It took nearly 20 minutes that night for Oni to settle fully, longer than it had ever taken with Petra alone, because the raised voice and the tightened grip had layered a second fear on top of the storm before either of them managed to unwind it. When the child finally slept, boneless and exhausted against Petra's shoulder, Thessaly sat on the floor beside them both, her formal composure entirely gone, and said the thing that had clearly been sitting in her chest since the first scream. "I am not going to be able to do this alone." "No," Petra agreed gently, because there was no kindness left in pretending otherwise. "Not yet. But that's not the same thing as not being able to do it at all." Thessaly did not ask outright that night for the lessons that would eventually reshape both of their evenings. The shock was still too raw, and morning was going to bring its own list of urgent things regardless of what either of them felt at midnight. But something had shifted in the room that neither of them said aloud again, until the memo forced the question into the open a week later, when there was no time left to approach it slowly, and a frightened mother who had already failed once alone finally asked a 22-year-old human woman to teach her properly, hand over hand, everything 20 years of command had never once required of her. The emergency fitness review hearing was scheduled for the 14th day after the Halcyon Wing's return, in the old council hall beneath the High Roost's central spire, a chamber built 3 centuries ago with acoustics specifically designed to carry a single speaker's voice to every seated member without amplification, because the Dominion's founders had believed, with a certainty that had not entirely survived 300 years of practical politics, that a chamber built for honesty would tend to produce it. In the 11 days between the filing and the hearing, 3 separate things happened, each of them landing with the particular cruelty of events that arrive exactly when a person has the least capacity left to absorb them. The first was that Riveth Iskar, working the private channels of council politics with the patient, methodical care he brought to everything, secured pledges from 6 of the council's 11 seated wardens to support the bond nurse's removal regardless of what the fitness review concluded about the sovereign herself. Enough votes, combined with his own, to pass the recommendation outright, which meant that whatever Thessaly said in that chamber, whatever Petra said, the outcome of Petra's own employment was very likely already decided before either of them opened her mouth. The second was that the 4 seconds of leaked relay footage, replayed and re-replayed and picked apart frame by frame across every unlicensed channel on Viral, produced a public reaction considerably uglier and considerably more organized than either the Council or the Crown had anticipated. A fringe movement that had existed for years at the ragged edges of Corail nationalist politics, calling itself the Rootbound and holding, with real sincerity beneath its uglier instincts, that the Dominion's steady integration of human labor and human technology, and now human caregivers into Corail institutions, was hollowing out something essential about what it meant to be Corail, seized on the plaza footage as proof of everything it had been arguing for a decade. Within a week, Rootbound rallies outside the High Roost's outer gates had grown from a few dozen sign-carrying elders to crowds numbering in the low thousands, chanting for the human nurse's removal, and, in the uglier corners of the movement's private channels, for considerably more than that. Vesk saw the rallies grow with his own eyes, because it was his duty to walk the High Roost's outer perimeter twice daily and report back to the Sovereign on the mood of the crowds gathered there, a duty that had been a formality for years and had, within a week of the plaza broadcast, become something considerably more urgent. He watched the crowd outside the western gate swell from a few dozen elders with hand-lettered signs to several thousand voices chanting in the old formal cadence, the Rootbound favored precisely, because it echoed the same ceremonial registers the Crown itself used, a calculated borrowing that made the movement's rhetoric sound, to anyone half listening, almost indistinguishable from patriotism. He reported what he saw plainly, without embellishment, because Thessaly had never once in 20 years of service wanted anything from him but the plain truth, however unwelcome. "They are not all extremists, Sovereign," he told her, on the 7th evening, standing in her private study with his hands folded behind his back in the posture he'd held through 2 previous reigns worth of hard news. "Most of them are simply frightened people who watched their sovereign's most private moment broadcast to the whole Dominion and don't have anywhere better to put that feeling. The Rootbound leadership is using that fear, but the fear itself is real, and it did not begin with any of them." "What would you have me do about it, Vesk?" "Nothing tonight," he said. "Tomorrow perhaps something. Tonight I would have you sleep, if you can manage it, because you are going to need every part of yourself steady for what is coming, and fear does not respond well to being met by more fear." Reveth Iskar was hearing a version of the same warning that same week, from Warden Iset Combe, the oldest sitting member of the Regency Council, and the one warden whose support Reveth had never fully secured, precisely because Iset Combe had spent 40 years in council service developing an allergy to exactly the kind of momentum Reveth's case was now riding. "You have the votes," Iset told him, in the dry, unhurried tone of a man who had outlasted 3 wardens more ambitious than Reveth Iskar would ever be. "I've counted them myself. You will win this, Reveth, whatever the hearing actually produces in the way of evidence. I want you to sit with that fact a moment before you decide it is the same thing as being right. The writ exists for exactly this circumstance. The writ exists to protect a child," Iset said, "not to settle old arguments about what belongs to us and what doesn't. I have watched you build this case for 6 years, Reveth, and I have admired most of it because most of it was honest. I am asking you, as a man who will not be in this chamber to watch the consequences land the way you will, to make sure that, when this is finished, you can still tell the difference between the two." Reveth Iskar did not have a good answer for him that evening, and the absence of one sat with him considerably longer than he would have liked to admit. Not every reaction to the plaza broadcast was ugly, though it took longer for the gentler ones to reach anyone's attention. In the same week, the root-bound rallies grew loud enough to draw Vesk's daily reports. The Crown Nursery's public correspondence office, a small, overworked staff of 3, entirely unprepared for what the plaza footage had done to their mail volume, began receiving letters by the thousand from ordinary households across Viral and its outlying colonies, the overwhelming majority of them not angry at all. Some were from other war households, mothers and fathers who had served through the Longdark Reach's 20 months and come home to children who did not fully know them either, writing simply to say that they recognized what they had seen on that plaza and had never before had a word for it. Some were from Corail parents who had used bond nurses of their own species during the Reach and wanted to say that the arrangement had never once felt to them like a betrayal of anything, only like help, arriving exactly when help was needed. A handful, a genuinely striking number for an office used to processing perhaps a dozen letters a week, were from human colonists scattered across the Dominion's border worlds, thanking the Crown, however awkwardly, for the plaza's raw, unfiltered honesty about what human presence had actually come to mean inside Corail households. Not a threat to be managed, but a kind of steadiness some families had quietly come to depend on and rarely said so out loud. Ray Holt brought a modest stack of these letters to the nursery herself on the 9th day, setting them on the low table beside Oni's abandoned blocks without much ceremony. "You don't have to read them," she told Petra. "I know the loud ones outside the west gate are the ones that get into your dreams. I just didn't want you to go into that hearing believing they were the only voice out there." Petra read a handful of them that night, after Oni was down, sitting on the nursery floor with the ash-gray blanket folded in her lap the way she sometimes held it when the day had asked more of her than she'd expected to give. One letter from a Corail grandmother on a border colony 3 systems out said simply that her own daughter served in the 4th Fleet, and that her daughter's own son did not know his mother's face yet either, and that she had no bond nurse of any species, only her own tired hands and whatever she could learn fast enough. "Tell the Crown Nursery girl, if it reaches her," the letter closed, "that what she is doing has a name in the old dialect my grandmother used to speak. It means the one who holds the door open until the right hands come home. I did not know until I saw your plaza that there were people paid to be exactly that, and I am glad, whatever the council decides, that my sovereign's own daughter had won." It did not change the vote Count Reveth Iskar had already secured. It did not stop the memo, or the rally outside the West Gate, or the 90 seconds that would follow days later in the council hall. But it sat with Petra through the rest of that hard week in a way she found herself returning to more than once, and she carried the grandmother's letter, folded small, in her jacket pocket on the morning of the hearing itself, because some kinds of steadiness needed to be borrowed from more than one source to last the whole day. The third thing, the one that did the most damage, was smaller and quieter and took longer to surface. A memo, 3 pages, formatted in the clinical register of the Crown Nursery's own physicians, alleging that Petra Lund had employed unauthorized affect conditioning techniques on the infant Ondine Marn. Techniques the memo described, in language chosen with real precision to sound damning without technically lying, as designed to produce a bonding response that would supersede the child's natural attachment to her own mother. It was not true. It was, in fact, close to the opposite of true. Every technique Petra had used had been drawn straight from Directorate-approved wartime childcare protocol, developed by Corail physicians themselves, and every log Petra had filed twice a week for 19 months documented exactly that, in exhausting bureaucratic detail. But the memo did not need to be true to do its damage. It needed only to exist, and to leak, 3 days before the hearing, to a public already primed by root-bound rhetoric to believe the worst about a human woman who had somehow, however innocently, ended up standing between a mother and her own child. The memo had been written by a junior council clerk named de Savray, 26 years old. 3 years into a career she had built entirely around her devotion to Reveth Iskar's constitutional project, and she had written it and leaked it entirely on her own initiative, without Reveth Iskar's knowledge or order, because she had convinced herself, in the private zealous logic of someone who believed absolutely in a cause, and only partly in the rules meant to constrain how that cause got pursued, that the warden's careful, honest case needed a sharper edge than honesty alone was providing, and that a small dishonesty in service of a large truth was not really dishonesty at all. Reveth Iskar found out about the memo the same afternoon everyone else did, from a council secretary who assumed he had authorized it, and spent one long, cold, silent hour alone in his office deciding what to do about a piece of ammunition he had not asked for and could not, in front of a council he had spent 11 days assembling, afford to visibly repudiate 3 days before the vote that would make his entire 6-year project either vindicated or irrelevant. He did not repudiate it. He told himself he would address it properly, later, once the more important question of the child's welfare had been settled. A piece of reasoning he would come to regret with real, uncomfortable clarity before the week was finished, but which felt, in that cold hour, like the only defensible order of operations available to him. Petra learned about the memo from Thessaly herself, who came to find her in the nursery's side room at close to midnight, 3 days before the hearing, holding a data slate with the memo's text already displayed, her face doing something complicated that Petra hadn't seen it do before. "I want you to read this," Thessaly said, "and then I want you to tell me it isn't true because I already know it isn't, and I need to hear you say it anyway." Petra read it standing up, in the low nursery light, with Oni asleep 2 rooms away, and felt something go cold and then very hot in her chest as she worked through all 3 pages. "It's not true," she said when she'd finished. "Every technique in my logs is directorate protocol. The physical soothing sequence, the sound and light drill matching, all of it. I didn't invent any of it. I followed the manual they gave me on my first day, and I filed every session in the reports your own office has had access to for 19 months. If someone actually reads those reports next to this memo, the memo falls apart in about 10 minutes. "I believe you," Thessaly said. "I want you to understand I have believed you since the moment I read the thing, not after. But I also need you to understand what I'm about to say to you, because I think you deserve to hear it plainly rather than have it happen to you without warning." She set the slate down on the low table beside Oni's abandoned blocks. "The hearing is in 3 days. I have counted the votes as carefully as my people can count them, and Reveth Iskar has enough wardens behind him to remove you from this nursery regardless of what either of us says in that chamber. This memo does not need to survive scrutiny to do its work. It only needs to exist long enough to give 6 wardens who are already inclined to vote against you one more piece of paper to point to when someone asks them why." Petra was quiet for a moment, feeling the floor of something she had built her whole adult life around start to genuinely shift under her. "Then what happens to Oni," she said finally, "if I'm not here?" "Corail nursery staff take over her care immediately," Thessaly said. "Fully trained, fully qualified, entirely well-meaning Corail nursery staff, who have never run a single ember drill in their lives, and will have exactly no idea why the child in their care goes rigid and silent every time someone lights a room in amber." Neither of them said the rest of it out loud, though both of them were thinking it, that the removal Reveth Iskar had built his entire case around, in the name of protecting a mother-daughter bond, he genuinely believed the nursery had damaged, would in practice strip Oni of the one steady presence who actually understood what the war had done to her small nervous system, at the exact moment her own mother most needed to learn how to read those same signals herself. "I'll resign," Petra said. It came out of her fast before she'd fully decided to say it, though some part of her had clearly been turning it over for days. "Before the hearing. I'll submit it tomorrow morning quietly, no fight, no scandal for the council to feed on. If I'm gone before the vote, there's no fitness question left for Iskar to hang his case on, and maybe that takes the wind out of the memo too, since there's nothing left to remove. No, Thessaly said, and the word came out with more force than either of them expected, enough that Oni stirred faintly in the next room and both women went still, waiting, until the small sounds of settling sleep resumed. When Thessaly spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less certain. No. I did not spend 20 months at Amaranth Reach learning to hold a line under fire so that I could come home and hand my daughter's whole steady world to a man who has never once sat in this room at 3 in the morning to find out what actually happens when the amber lights come on unplanned. You are not resigning. Whatever happens in that chamber, it is going to happen with both of our names on it, not just yours. Petra looked at her for a long moment. This woman who 20 months of command had trained to spend fear like currency and never show it spent, and saw, underneath the flat certainty of the words, something that looked very much like a mother finally deciding what kind of fight she was willing to have. Then I need you to do something for me before the hearing, Petra said. Something that isn't going to be comfortable and isn't going to fix everything, but that I think matters more right now than the vote. Name it. Learn the 4 count, Petra said. Tonight, now if you can stand it. Not because it's going to make Reveth Iskar's memo go away, and not because it's going to win you the hearing. Because your daughter is going to be in that room whether either of us wants her to be or not. Iskar's put her presentation into the hearing agenda himself. As evidence, God help us. And if the lights in that chamber do anything even slightly wrong, I would rather you were the one who could reach her. Thessaly Marn, sovereign of the Ember Throne, victor of the Longdark Reach, who had not cried once in 20 months of war, sat down on the nursery floor at close to midnight, 3 days before the hearing that would decide her daughter's future, and let a 22-year-old human woman teach her, hand over hand, how to press a rhythm into her own child's back that a war had made necessary and a homecoming had made urgent. It did not go well at first. Thessaly's hands, trained for 20 years to hold a helm or a weapon, moved too fast, too certain, the way command always moved, and Petra had to stop her twice and slow her down, showing her the exact pressure, the exact patience, the specific stillness the rhythm actually required. By the 3rd attempt, working against a sleeping child 2 rooms away rather than the real thing, Thessaly's hands had begun, haltingly, to find something closer to what 19 months had taught Petra's own hands to do without thinking. You've done this every night, Thessaly said quietly, somewhere in the 4th or 5th attempt, not quite a question. Most nights, Petra said, not every one. There were a few weeks around the Amaranth Reach engagement, where the relay news was bad enough that she picked up on something in the staff, even without understanding any of it, and needed it twice a night instead of once. Thessaly's hands stilled for a moment on the practice cushion Petra had set out for her. I gave the order that started that engagement, she said. I didn't think about what it cost anyone this far from the front. I don't think you could have, Petra said, not as an absolution exactly, but as a plain fact laid down between them. You were doing the thing that kept the whole Dominion standing so there'd be a home for her to come back to. I was doing the thing that kept her steady until you could. Neither of those things makes the other one smaller. Thessaly looked at her for a long moment in the low nursery light, and something in her face, the same face that had broken open on the plaza and then shut itself carefully back down in front of 11,000 witnesses, opened again, just slightly, just for Petra, in a way it had not done for anyone since before the Reach began. I am going to need you to teach me a great deal more than one rhythm, she said, if I am going to be any good at this at all. You've got 3 days, Petra said. I'll teach you everything I can fit into them. They did not get all 3 days. On the 2nd morning, 40 hours before the hearing, the council received a fresh advisory from the palace's own security division. One of dozens filed weekly since the plaza broadcast, most of them routine, flagging a spike in encrypted route-bound channel traffic referencing. in language the analysts assessed as aspirational rather than operational, some kind of direct action planned to coincide with the fitness review hearing itself. The advisory was filed, logged, and largely disregarded by a council staff already buried under the more immediate business of preparing 11 wardens for the largest public hearing the chamber had hosted in a decade. Because the Rootbund had made a great many aspirational threats over the years and acted on almost none of them, and because nobody in the security division had connected that particular channel traffic to the specific detail. Buried 3 pages deep in Reveth Iskar's own hearing agenda, that the infant heir herself was scheduled to be brought into the council hall as evidence during the proceedings' second hour. The hearing convened at mid-morning on the 14th day, in the old council hall beneath the high roost central spire, its acoustics built 3 centuries ago to carry an honest voice without help, and in 300 years, having heard a great many voices that were not honest at all. 11 wardens sat the long curved bench at the chamber's head, Reveth Iskar at its center, his second-best formal plumage exchanged for his ceremonial best, his posture the careful, contained posture of a man who had spent 6 years building toward exactly this morning, and did not intend to let anyone see how much the memo he had not authorized was sitting wrong in his stomach. Thessaly Marn sat at the petitioner's table below the bench, in the same command plumage she had come home in, deliberately, a small, sharp piece of political theater that Vesk had argued against, and she had overruled, because she wanted every warden in that room to look at her and remember exactly where she had been for 20 months and why. Petra sat beside her, in the plain nursery clothes she wore every day of her working life, because Thessaly had insisted, quietly, the night before, that Petra Lund owed this chamber nothing but the truth of who she actually was. The first hour went the way Petra had privately expected it would go, which was badly. Reveth Iskar laid out his case with the same patient, methodical care he brought to everything. The nesting writ's dormant authority, the physician's twice-yearly reports read aloud in careful clinical excerpt, the plaza footage replayed once, briefly, respectfully, without commentary, because he did not need commentary. The footage spoke for itself to a chamber that had already watched it 100 times on private channels before this morning. He did not mention the leaked memo directly. He had decided, in the cold hour after he learned of it, that he would not build his own case on a document he had not authorized and could not fully defend, but he did not need to mention it either. 6 wardens on the bench had already read it, and its shadow sat over every question they asked. Thessaly answered every question levelly, without flinching, laying out the Emberdrill Protocol's directorate origins, the 19 months of filed logs, the plain mechanical explanation Petra had given her on the nursery floor 11 days earlier, the horns, the amber light, the crowd noise, a drill working exactly as designed on the one day nobody had planned for it to be tested against a homecoming. It was a good answer. It was, Petra thought, watching from beside her, probably the best answer the true facts of the situation could produce. One of the 6 wardens Reveth Iskar had secured, an angular older woman named Warden Kalves who had said almost nothing through the whole first hour, finally leaned forward at her place on the bench. "I do not doubt the mechanism you describe, Sovereign," she said. "I have read the same logs. My question is simpler than the warden's case requires it to be, and I would ask you to answer it as plainly as you have answered everything else today. Whose face does your daughter know best in this entire dominion?" The chamber went very still. In the particular way a room goes still when a question has finally been asked without any of the careful padding around it that every other question that morning had carried. "Hers," Thessaly said, and did not look away from Kalves, and did not look toward Petra either, though every person in the chamber understood exactly who she meant. "It is not a comfortable answer, Warden. I did not come into this chamber today to make it a comfortable one. My daughter knows Petra Lund's face best in this entire dominion, because I was 3 systems away for 19 of her 22 months, keeping this Dominion whole enough to come home to. I am not ashamed of the war. I am not going to pretend in front of this bench that the war cost nothing. What I am asking this council to understand is that the cost already happened. It happened months ago, quietly, without anyone's vote, the way real costs generally do. The only question left in front of you is whether removing the one person who paid attention while it happened will somehow undo it, or whether it will simply mean my daughter loses that too, on top of everything else this war already took from her before she was old enough to know its name. Warden Calves said nothing further, and made a small, unreadable note on the slate in front of her, and Petra understood, watching her, that whatever else this hearing decided, one vote in that chamber had just moved somewhere Reveth Iskar's careful count had not fully accounted for. It was not enough. Petra could see it in the set of 6 particular warden's shoulders, in the careful noncommittal way they took notes without ever quite meeting Thessaly's eyes, and she understood, with a cold, clear certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that Reveth Iskar's count had been accurate, that the vote had likely been decided before either of them walked into this chamber, and that nothing said in the next several hours was actually going to change it. It was into the second hour, with the chamber's attention beginning to fray at its edges the way any long formal proceedings attention eventually frays, that the doors at the hall's rear opened to admit the nursery escort bringing Ondine Marn in, as Reveth Iskar's agenda had specified, so that the assembled council could observe, briefly and respectfully, the child at the center of the entire proceeding. It was also, though nobody in the chamber yet knew it, the exact moment the Regency that had spent 11 days planning around that same published agenda line chose to move. The first sign anyone had was small and easy to miss: a flicker in the hall's overhead lighting, the ordinary kind of flicker any building's power grid produced occasionally, except that it did not resolve, and 30 seconds later the chamber's primary lighting dropped out entirely and the emergency system cut in behind it, exactly as designed, exactly as it had been designed for 3 centuries. Flooding the entire hall in the deep amber emergency wash that every building in Cindergate carried as backup power, the same amber the nesting spire's own drills had used 19 months running to teach one small girl what danger looked like. Ondine Marn, 22 months old, standing at the chamber's rear beside her nursery escort in a room that had just gone dark, and then amber all at once, in front of 11 strangers and a mother she barely knew and one single person whose presence her whole small nervous system had learned, over 19 careful months, to trust absolutely, did the only thing that training had ever taught her to do. She screamed and bolted. What happened in the next 90 seconds happened too fast for the chamber's own security to fully track, and would take investigators the better part of a week afterward to reconstruct from a dozen partial accounts. The Regency, 4 members, 2 of them junior palace maintenance staff with legitimate access to the building's power systems, who had spent months positioning themselves for exactly this kind of opportunity, had planned to use the blackout's confusion to move through the chamber's rear service corridor and seize the child during the few seconds of dark before the emergency lighting cut in, intending, in the genuinely held if catastrophically wrong-headed logic of true believers, to remove her from what they saw as a compromised royal household and deliver her, unharmed, to a root-bound safe house where she could be restored to what they considered a properly Corail upbringing, away from human influence entirely. They had not planned for the amber lighting itself to trigger the child before they ever reached her. They had not planned for a screaming, bolting toddler to be considerably harder to grab cleanly than a still one. And they had not planned, because almost nobody in that chamber had planned for it, because it had taken a war in 19 months and one catastrophic public homecoming to produce it, for Petra Lund to be already moving, out of her chair and across the chamber floor, faster than the 2 nearest guards, faster than the sovereign herself managed to clear the petitioner's table, calling Oni's name in the exact pitch, and rhythm the child had learned to trust above every other sound in her small world. "Oni, down hands 4 count, I'm here." It was not a rescue line. It was a drill line, the exact phrase Petra had used in a dozen real ember drills over 19 months, and Oni's body responded to it, the way 19 months of repetition had built her small nervous system to respond, dropping instinctively low and still in the chamber's central aisle, instead of continuing to bolt blind toward the rear service corridor, where the root-bound cells lead operative, a lean gray-plumed man named Vantor Ashgrave, had already broken from cover and was closing the last few meters between himself and the child. Thessaly Marn reached the aisle a half-second after Petra did, and what happened after that was not political theater and was not careful command doctrine. It was 20 years of a warrior's trained reflex meeting the single clearest purpose her body had ever been given, and she put herself bodily between Ashgrave's reaching hands and her daughter's small drop-low shape, with a speed that left 3 separate council wardens later swearing, in their own accounts, that they had genuinely believed for 1 full second that the sovereign herself was about to be struck down in her own council hall. Vesk was 3 steps behind the sovereign when she crossed the aisle, close enough afterward to describe Ashgrave's face in the amber light to the investigators who asked. Not the wild fervor Vesk had expected from a kidnapping attempt, but something flatter and more frightening. The calm, methodical certainty of a man who had convinced himself, over months of careful private conviction, that what he was about to do was a mercy rather than a crime. "She doesn't belong to a species that isn't hers," Ashgrave said, or started to say, the sentence still forming in his mouth when Thessaly's strike caught him across the jaw. "She was not struck down." Ashgrave, confronted at close range by a woman who had spent 20 months personally leading fleet actions against considerably worse odds than one desperate extremist in a darkened chamber, went down hard and fast under a strike that would leave him with a fractured jaw, and eventually a great deal of time to reconsider his convictions in a Regency holding cell. His 2 accomplices in the maintenance corridor were taken within the minute by palace guards, finally catching up to a crisis that had, in truth, resolved itself in the 90 seconds before they arrived. Guards fanning out past overturned chairs, and a herald still shouting for a calm nobody in the chamber, had any use for any more robed wardens scrambling clear of the bench in a scene that would, within the hour, be the single most replayed piece of security footage in the Dominion's history. The 4th member of the cell, stationed at a relay junction 2 floors below, was apprehended an hour later trying to walk out of the building as though nothing at all had happened. Through all of it, through the strike, through the guards' arrival, through the chamber's slow shift from chaos back into some kind of order, Petra Lund never once stopped the 4 count. She had only gathered up against her chest within seconds of the child dropping low, both arms wrapped tight around her, palm pressed flat and steady into the small of her back, murmuring the same 4 low notes she had murmured 1,000 times before in quiet rooms with the blinds down, and it was that steady, unbroken rhythm, more than the guards, more than the sovereign's strike, more than anything else in the chamber, that kept Ondine Marn from a shock her small body might not have come back from cleanly. It was Thessaly, though, breathing hard, 1 knuckle split and bleeding from the strike that had put Ashgrave down, who knelt beside them both in the amber light a moment later, and instead of reaching for her daughter the way every instinct in her screamed to, matched her own hand to the same 4 count rhythm against Oni's small shaking shoulder, the way 3 nights of practice on a nursery floor had taught her to do, and waited. It took almost a full minute. Petra felt it happen before she saw it, felt Oni's rigid shaking body register a second steady hand joining the rhythm, felt the child's breathing hitch, and then, slowly, begin to match the count instead of fighting it. And then, in the amber wash of a council hall that had nearly become a crime scene, Ondine Marn turned her small tear-streaked face away from Petra's shoulder for the first time since the lights had failed, and looked at the war-marked woman crouched beside her with a split knuckle and a face still doing something complicated and careful, and reached out 1 small hand, and closed it around her mother's finger. She did not go to Thessaly fully. She kept the other fist knotted just as tightly in Petra's collar as she had on the plaza 14 days earlier. But she held both of them at once, one hand in each, and the amber emergency lights held steady overhead. And for the first time in 22 months, in the wreckage of an attempted kidnapping in the middle of her own fitness hearing, Ondine Marn was not choosing between her mother and the woman who had raised her through a war. She was simply, finally, holding onto both. The chamber was very quiet after that, not the confused murmur of the plaza, but something closer to 11 wardens, and a council hall's worth of guards and staff watching a moment. None of them had words ready for. It was Reveth Iskar, of all people, who broke the silence, rising from the bench with his own formal plumage still faintly disheveled from the chaos. His careful constitutional composure cracked open in a way none of them had seen from him in 6 years of council service, and walking down from the bench to stand over the small group in the aisle. "De Savre's memo did not come from me," he said, before anyone else could speak, in a voice with none of its usual careful measure left in it. "I want that on this chamber's record before one more word is spoken. I did not authorize it, and I regret, more than I can currently find words to explain, that I did not repudiate it the moment I learned of its existence, because I judged the timing wrong and let a piece of dishonest work sit unchallenged in service of a case I still believe, even now, was built on an honest question." He looked down at Oni, still gripping one hand in each woman's, and something in his composure finally, fully gave way. "I do not know any more, Sovereign, whether the question I was trying to answer was the right one to be asking at all." "It was the right question," Thessaly said, and her voice, for the first time since Petra had known her, held no trace of command in it at all, just a mother, kneeling on a chamber floor, exhausted and bleeding lightly from one knuckle, holding her daughter's hand. "You were right to ask it, Warden. You were simply wrong about the answer. My daughter was not raised by the wrong hands. She was raised by hands that understood something about what this war did to her that I did not have the chance to learn, because I was 3 systems away learning something else instead. That is not a wound in this household. That is the reason she is alive to hold either of our hands at all." The fitness review hearing did not reconvene that day, or the next. What emerged instead, over the following 6 weeks, was something neither Thessaly nor Petra nor even Reveth Iskar had fully anticipated on the morning the Halcyon wing first broke atmosphere. The Council's investigation into the Rupuncel's planning, which had, disturbingly, drawn on internal knowledge of the hearing's own published agenda to time its move, forced an uncomfortable reckoning across the Regency Council about how a supposedly protective institutional process had nearly gotten a 2-year-old heir killed by publicizing, in exhaustive administrative detail, exactly when and where she would be brought into a public chamber. De Savre's memo, thoroughly investigated once Reveth Iskar himself demanded the inquiry, was found to be exactly what Petra had said it was from the start. A fabrication built from selectively edited fragments of Petra's own genuine nursery logs, twisted just far enough to imply intent that the underlying record flatly did not support. Vray resigned before the council could formally remove her, and Reveth Iskar, in a public statement that cost him a great deal of the careful reputation he had spent 6 years building, apologized to Petra Lund by name, in the council hall, on the record, for allowing a case he believed in to be carried, even briefly, on a lie he had not told but had failed to stop. The nesting writ itself was not repealed, Thessaly argued, and Reveth Iskar, to his considerable credit, came to agree that the underlying principle behind it, that a child's welfare should never simply be assumed safe inside unchecked royal privilege, was sound even if its application this time had been badly mishandled. What emerged instead, after 6 weeks of careful drafting between the Ember Throne and the Regency Council, was a formal amendment the Council came to call the Twin Hearth Clause. a standing provision recognizing that a royal heir's caregivers, in times of war or extended absence, could include a bonded non-Corail attendant as a formally protected co-guardian, with legal standing equal to any Corail nursery appointment, immune to political removal on the basis of species alone, reviewable only through the same rigorous welfare standard applied to any caregiver, Corail or otherwise. Petra Lund was the clause's first formal appointee, 3 weeks after the hearing that never finished, in a quiet ceremony that drew nothing like the crowd the homecoming had drawn, which suited her considerably better. The clause itself did not pass quietly in the 6 weeks of drafting that led to it. Iset Combe, who had warned Reveth Iskar to mind the difference between winning and being right, spoke last before the final vote, and said, in the dry, unhurried register he brought to everything that mattered, that he had sat on this council for 40 years waiting to see whether it would ever choose a child's actual welfare over the comfort of an old assumption, and that he intended to die having voted for it at least once. The clause passed 9 votes to 2, with Reveth Iskar's own vote among the 9 cast. He told the chamber afterward, in the plainest possible atonement I know how to offer, which is simply doing the next thing correctly. Petra was not in the chamber for that vote. She was 3 floors up, in the nursery, teaching a still uncertain sovereign how to read the specific difference between Oni's hungry fuss and her tired fuss, a distinction that had taken Petra the better part of a month to learn by instinct, and that she now had to teach in words, slowly, patiently, the same way she taught everything. The ember drills stopped, gradually, over the following months, not all at once, because a nervous system built by 19 months of war did not unlearn its training in a season, but steadily, as Thessaly Marn learned, in patient nightly practice that never again required an emergency to force it, exactly how to read her own daughter's small signals, exactly when a room's light or sound was about to tip into something Oni's body remembered as danger. Exactly how to press a steady 4 count into a small shaking back until the shaking stopped. It did not become easy quickly, and it did not move in one clean direction. There was a hard week, 5 weeks after the hearing, when a delayed relay dispatch about a border skirmish, nothing like the Reach, nothing that required Thessaly to leave, but enough old readiness stirred in her own body that her plumage darkened involuntarily for 2 full days, sent Oni skittish and clingy in a way neither of them had seen since before the 4-count lessons began, and both women spent that week relearning together that healing was not a debt that stayed paid once settled. There was also, the following week, a small unremarkable evening that neither of them would have thought to mark as significant beforehand, when a service cart backfired somewhere below the nursery windows with a sound sharp enough to have once sent Oni straight into Petra's arms without a single beat of hesitation. And instead, for the first time since the plaza, the child's first instinct carried her 2 startled steps toward her mother. Reaching up with both hands before she had even fully registered which adult was nearest, Thessaly caught her, knelt down instantly into the 4 count without needing to be told, and did not look at Petra over the top of Oni's head to see whether she had witnessed it, because for once it did not need witnessing to be real. Petra saw it anyway from the doorway, and found that it did not cost her anything at all to feel glad of it. A small, clean, uncomplicated gladness that surprised her with how little grief rode along beside it, and that told her, more clearly than any council vote ever could, that whatever she had built in this nursery over 19 months had never actually been in competition with what Thessaly was finally learning to build now. It had simply been holding the space open until there was a mother steady enough to stand in it too. By the time Ondine Marn turned 3, in a quiet household celebration in the nesting spire's east gallery, with Thessaly Marn's war-worn plumage finally settled back into its peacetime colors and Petra Lund seated, by long habit rather than any remaining formality, at the child's left hand, Oni no longer flinched at horns, or amber light, or crowded rooms full of noise. She simply reached for whichever hand was nearest when the world got loud, and trusted, without having to think about it at all, that either one would hold steady. Reveth Iskar sent a small gift for the occasion, unannounced, delivered by his own hand rather than through council channels. A carved wooden block, the fifth in a set of 5, matched precisely to the 4 Oni had spent 19 months learning to stack before the day everything else in her small world came apart, and slowly, painstakingly, came back together stronger for the breaking. He did not stay for the celebration. He simply left the block with a short note, in his own careful hand, that read, "I was wrong about what needed protecting. I am grateful the Dominion had 2 better guardians than me to get it right." Petra kept the note. She kept the ash-gray blanket too, the one her own grandmother had wrapped her in on a much worse night than any of this, on a border colony called Halden's Rest that a different war had taken from her when she was 7 years old. The blanket she had carried with her across the years, and the systems until it found its way, entirely by accident, into a Corail nursery, and became the one steady thing a frightened infant learned to trust before she learned almost anything else. She thought sometimes, in the quiet hours after Oni was down for the night, and the high roost's halls had gone dim and peaceful in a way that no longer meant anything except that it was simply, finally, nighttime, about the 7-year-old girl who had once needed exactly this kind of steadiness from a stranger, and never forgotten what it cost that stranger to give it. She thought about how strange it was that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had taught her, eventually, the exact shape of the best thing she would ever do. And on the nights when Thessaly came to find her there, in the nursery's soft lamplight, to sit together for a while before either of them slept, not as sovereign and appointee anymore, not really, but as 2 women who had built something neither of them could have built alone, Petra would look at the woman who had once knelt on a plaza with her arms open and empty in front of 11,000 witnesses, and now sat instead with her daughter asleep between them. One small hand curled loosely around each of their fingers even in sleep, and think that some homecoming simply took longer than others to finish arriving. That was, in the end, the whole of what either of them had ever really needed to understand. A war could be won in 20 months. A child's trust, once broken by circumstance rather than by any failure of love, could take a great deal longer to rebuild, but it could be rebuilt, patiently, 4 counts at a time, by anyone willing to kneel on the floor and do the slow, unglamorous work of earning it back. Ondine Marn grew up knowing 2 homes for her own hand to reach for, and never once had to choose between them again.